Blood for the Blood God, skulls for the Skull Throne, brutal damage dealing infantry, great melee cavalry with great monsters to dish out tons of damage in combat. Khorne is all about the melee and the damage they inflict on others. In this video I'll show you every unit from the roster before and after research, redline skills and XP, and I'll also show you the lords and heroes and their abilities in campaign. Let's get to it. So as an example of what you're about to see, I have all the stats, of course with the typical stats in the left as you see there, in this case for the Exalted Bloodletters of Khorne, and then I give you the stats after research, after XP and redline skills. So in red the redline skills, in blue the research, and in yellow the XP. So this way you can make a little bit better decisions, knowing a little bit more how the unit will look like, at least in terms of stats, in the late game, which is always good to ensure that you are feeling confident that you can use that unit later on. So your army has the advantage of having great and powerful infantry, great monsters and single entities, good cavalry and chariots, with some disadvantages of course of weak missile choices and lacking missile options overall, and you also lack any form of magic. It's all about the weapon damage, the melee attack. Those are the stats that you focus on, and those are the ones that Khorne uses to gain an edge over the enemy. In terms of army specifics, let's start with the Mark of Khorne. So basically this affects many units in your army. They gain frenzy, increased spell resistance, and it lowers their melee defense. By the way, this is already translated into the stats, so you don't have to make any calculations, of course. Just be aware that this is the main difference between, for instance, Chaos Warriors of Khorne and normal Chaos Warriors. That's all there is to it, not a lot in terms of a mechanic in itself, just to ensure that you are aware that these are your strengths. You gain frenzy, you gain spell resistance, and you have reduced melee defense in retrospect. So one of the specifics that can happen in your army is that you have many units that are demonic. This implies that they have physical resistance, they do not rout, they are immune to terror, and they take damage when leadership is low. This last part interests you. So basically if the leadership starts getting too low, you can see the amount of damage, it's quite significant, so the unit would definitely be destroyed very soon. So you gotta take steps to ensure that if you see that leadership getting low, don't waste time, remove it from combat, help that unit out, otherwise you may lose it in the end of the battle. So you do have some army abilities basically. You can unlock these by ensuring that you kill. The more entities that you kill, the better, because it will unlock the abilities. The first one, the Horn of Khorne, an augment in an area to give melee attack plus 24. Not that you need those 24. Your unit's already very powerful, but of course this is really powerful to ensure that your units hit hard whatever they are targeting. Then we do have Relentless Rage. This is an giving unbreakable to your allies. This is great specifically for those demonic units so that they don't rout, that they don't take that leadership loss, and because of that they don't start crumbling, that they don't become banished, then you lose the unit. So it's really useful. And then you have the Blade of Khorne. This is a massive explosion, a very big radius, which will give a huge explosion area and wreck nearly anything that is there. So if the enemy is piled up and you have this ability, just ensure that you spawn that Blade of Khorne on top of them, and it will kill them basically. There's nothing to say about it. It's a really powerful, it's not a spell, it's a powerful ability, but well, let's call it a spell. Skarbrand the Exiled. Skarbrand is simply put one of the biggest duelists in the entire game. Now he has good armor, great speed, I mean he's faster than most cavalry units really. He has great melee attack, I mean almost the maximum amount I would say. He also has magical and flaming attacks, so he causes that. He's great against those ethereal units, against those with physical resistances. He has very decent melee defense still, he's just more focused into the melee attack. crazy amounts of weapon strength already and a nice charge bonus. Simply put, whenever you target with him, whatever you do, it should be gone in a few seconds. He's gonna kill it really fast. Now, his vulnerability is enemy missiles, since he lacks those shields. He has a nice health pool to compensate for that, and still decent armor. So you can use that speed and that mass, I mean 6,000, it's really good, to get him out of any trouble. Remember that he does cause terror, so you can use him as that. And he also is demonic, so be careful when the leadership is shattered. You know, just make sure that it doesn't reach that point, otherwise you're gonna lose him. But still, one of the easiest lords to decide what to do, just send him out, he'll do a lot of damage. In terms of abilities, he has the Rage Embodied and the upgrade that I visualize here, the Rage Incarnate. Basically an area hex to enemies, giving them Rampage, which is really good. When rampaging, they don't obey any orders, which is awesome, so that you can kill them, of course. Then he has also the, let me show, the Wrathful Reaper. This is an augment to his weapon damage, base weapon damage, of course, and armor-piercing weapon damage. It also rampages him, so Scarbred can rampage as well, so be careful not to use this unless you know what you're doing, because of course during that time he won't obey your orders. Now we also have the Drink of Blood, which will give him the Gore Feast, basically a regeneration while he's in melee. Very good for such a lord. And finally, we do have some other abilities that you can get with the melee line. The Bellow of Endless Fury, a magic missile with 3 charges, good armor piercing, not a lot of range, can only use out of melee, so this is mostly like a breath attack, really. And then he also has the Fueled by Rage. This is a passive ability. So if his hit points are below 50%, it increases his damage, which is always nice. As you can see, tons of ways of increasing that already very strong weapon strength. In addition, he also gets the passive ability Slaughter and Carnage, increasing his weapon damage up to 100% based on each skill made. So the more entities killed, the more damage. This is crazy. All these abilities get Scarbred to a crazy weapon strength, to the point that he one-shots or two-shots nearly anything. The Herald of Khorne is a powerful melee lord, low armor, good speed still, he's quite fast on his feet, a great melee attack, which also has flaming attacks and magical attacks, which is always excellent. It helps against specific enemies. Decent melee defense. He's much better, of course, at the offense than the defense. This is a staple of Khorne's gameplay, really. He also has a majority of armor-piercing weapon strength with bonuses versus infantry. He's perfect versus enemy heroes or lords that are small targets or that don't have a mount, or versus enemy infantry units. So he can definitely be on the front line assisting your infantry units. Just remember that he causes fear, but he's also demonic, so watch out for his lower leadership. So the Herald of Khorne has the Hellblade ability, which gives them weapon damage with more than 80 kills, then the choice of Locus of Abjuration, of Fury, or of Wrath. Abjuration gives the plus 66% spell resistance to nearby allies. You also have Locus of Fury, giving you charge bonus and weapon damage to nearby allies, or you can have Locus of Wrath, which gives you a hefty plus 40 melee attack to allies in range. Of course, remember that you have to choose which one you apply. This flying behemoth is the Exalted Bloodthirster. A great choice for a lord due to the obvious mobility because he flies, great armor, great speed, tons of melee attack, which is also magic and fire, so it's really good against a variety of targets. Not a lot of melee defense compared to other lords as well, but still quite decent. And then we have tons of armor-piercing weapon damage and the nice charge bonus, so great to defeat enemy lords and heroes or other single entities, or against anything really, but it's just the good thing about Khorne is that they always have a lord that can engage in melee. Now, he also causes terror, but he's also demonic, so be careful with that leadership running low. So, for the abilities of the Exalted Bloodthirster, we have the Wrath of Khorne. This is an explosion that affects anyone that is casting near him, just not a lot of range, 60 meters only. Then we have the possibility, of course, of the Bellow of Fury, which is a magic missile, 3 charges, good damage, but low range. Then we also have the possibility of getting Burning Rage, which is an explosion, 3 charges, in a radius around you. In addition, when you level up him in the yellow line, you can get the Bloodthirst ability, which is a charge bonus, speed and charge speed bonus for 17 seconds, so ensure that you pop that up as he's charging the enemy. Then we have Deathbringer, which increases weapon damage, also good to combine with the Bloodthirst as well. So these are the abilities that you can get the Exalted Bloodthirster in the campaign. A heavily armored lord, the Chaos Lord of Khorne, has some advantages, of course, with that heavy armor. Lower speed, because, of course, of the armor. He has great melee attack with flaming attacks, which is always nice. Good melee defense. He actually has much better than other lords, really. And his weapon strength is still very high, although not specifically armor piercing. He does have a nice bonuses versus infantry to compensate, so the charge bonus is also significant enough for you to always ensure that he charges his target, which should for the most part be infantry sized. Now watch out for enemy armor piercing units or any large targets, as of course he's not well focused to it. In terms of abilities, you have the Rage ability, giving you physical resistance up to 10%, leadership up to 8, and melee attack up to 5. While in melee, this increases with the time that you spend in melee, so keep him in melee. Then we have Rampant Destroyer, giving you a heroic killing blow. This is well known, giving you 50% base and armor piercing weapon damage. You also have the Khorne Marked, giving you the Deathbringer ability, which is again plus 50% weapon damage, so plenty of abilities that give you a lot of weapon damage. And then we have the passive ability Paragon of Carnage, increasing melee attack up to 8 to nearby allies, increasing with each enemy death. So keep killing, killing enemies, of course, keep buffing your forces so that they kill even faster. That's the sort of idea. A powerful melee specialist, the Blood Reaper has low armor, good speed, that's decent to follow anyone. He has great melee attack with fire and magical attacks. Lower melee defense, so of course he's much better in offense than defense. Adding to this, great armor piercing damage with bonuses versus infantry. So he's great at taking out any target, perfect for those heroes and lords that do not have a mount or infantry units. Now remember that he also causes fear, and he is demonic, which implies that you have to watch out when he gets lower in his leadership. For the abilities of the Blood Reaper, you do have the Hellblade. This is an augment, increases his weapon damage with more than 80 kills. Then we have the choice of either the Locus of Abjuration, of Fury, or Wrath. So Locus of Abjuration, it's a ward save in an area, giving allies spell resistance 66%, so basically they kind of become immune to any spells, really, which is always great. Or you can focus on Fury, which gives them a charge bonus of 40% and more weapon damage, which is always nice, nearby allies, of course. And you can also give the Locus of Wrath, which gives a nice 40 melee attack to any allies in range. Good choices. Remember that you have to choose on these 3. The Cultist of Khorne, a powerful melee hero. The Cultist has good armor with the Silver Shield, so he's much better at being a tank, especially against those missiles. He has great melee attack and decent melee defense, so good amount of weapon strength, even though not specifically armor piercing. Charging him to get the most. He's a great support hero, really, being a sort of a tank covering for those missiles. Note that he doesn't have any magical attacks or flaming attacks, so that's not his purpose. For the most part, he's kind of like a support for your front lines, just ensuring that he soaks up some of the enemy missiles if they target him, which is already a very good idea. So for his abilities in campaign, he does have the Gate of Khorne, which is a summon ability, basically recharging while in melee, allowing you 3 charges to summon a unit of Bloodletters. And you also have the Greater Gate of Khorne, same thing to summon a unit, but in this case a Bloodthirster, and also recharging if engaged in melee. So keep him engaged in melee, and his abilities will recharge, and of course will give you these nice summons. The Exalted Hero of Khorne, he's heavily armored, not as fast as other heroes, note. He has crazy good melee attack and a lower melee defense, of course, a staple of Khorne's play. He has tons of weapon strength with the bonuses versus infantry, not a lot of armor piercing weapon damage though, and a great charge bonus. So charge him into a target, preferably infantry or small single entities, and he'll take care of them. So, for his abilities in campaign, he also has the Rage ability, so physical resistance, leadership, and melee attack while he's in melee. It increases with the time spent, so keep him in melee and he'll get even better at fighting. Then we also have the possibility of getting the Stand or Die, giving leadership and melee defense to nearby allies, so further enforcing the support role of this hero. And we also have the possibility of giving him instead the Hellblade, which increases the weapon damage with more than 80 kills. So that's sort of the idea for the Exalted Hero of Khorne. So just a note that all the calculations you're about to see in terms of Redline skills are in terms of the Herald's Redline skills, because they are different than the ones from the Chaos Lords. So just bear that in mind. I couldn't do everything, otherwise the video would be 2 hours, but just have that in mind, like when you're seeing the stats, remember that it's all for the Heralds and not for the Chaos Lords. Of course there's similarities in some of those, but still just have that in mind. It would be impossible for me to do both and still, you know, have a life. We begin with Marauders of Khorne. These are shielded warriors, basically. They do have that bronze shield, not a lot of armor, also not a lot of leadership. Do note all the augments that you see here are the effects of the Frenzy ability, including the immunity to psychology. So most of the units have that, actually, because of course of the Mark of Khorne that grants it. So in terms of melee attack, it's really good, of course. This is a staple across the whole faction, you know, more melee attack other than melee defense, of course. So very low melee defense. They're much better in offense than in defensive measures. A decent weapon strength, especially for what is basically a tier 1 unit. It's likely one of the best tier 1 units in the game, and still a nice charge bonus. Now, in terms of the late game, as you can see, they still become quite powerful. You know, getting more armor, getting more melee attack, and especially more melee defense, so overcoming a little bit of the weakness. You can still have a couple of sweeper armies using Marauders of Khorne definitely well into the late game. Now, if you wish to embrace the killing, let's go for Marauders of Khorne, but with dual weapons. These instead replace that shield with more melee attack and more weapon strength, and in this case they gain a bonuses versus infantry, so they are perfect in the early to mid game to cut off any infantry that the enemy sends to you. Of course, remember that they're very weak in melee in terms of melee defense. They will take damage, and especially they're weak against enemy missiles, so watch out for those. In the late game, or after every single upgrade, note that they're still very good infantry. They become like a tier 2 infantry, really. So it's only because you get better options as Khorne that you may not wish to use these guys, but still they are very good in a pinch. You know, if you need to recruit some units really fast, they'll do really well nicely, and especially with all that melee defense and physical resistance, which implies that they overcome a little bit of their weaknesses into the late game, and still, of course, they'll dish out tremendous amounts of damage. Now let's go into the demons, the demonic bloodletters of Khorne. Of course, so they are demonic. Be wary of that, you know, that leadership being low and them shattering and just being banished away. Not a lot of armor, good melee attack with magical attacks, which is always nice. They don't have a lot of melee defense, so as always the staple, focus on attacking and wrecking everything. They do have the advantage of being armor piercing, and they still have a bonus versus infantry. Definitely a solid frontline in any choice, especially if your intention is just to close up really fast with the enemy and dish out damage. In the late game, you can still field these guys pretty wisely. I mean, they get more leadership, you know, in encouraging you to actually get them into the battle, because of course, you know, less of a chance of that banishment happening, at least not before they dish out a lot of damage. So more weapon strength, more melee attack, they overcome a little bit of that weak melee defense. They even get a little bit more spell resistance and physical resistance. So yeah, definitely one unit that you can keep recruiting throughout the whole game. Now, to what is about one of the best holding infantries, especially, you know, at tier 2, there's nothing better than the Chaos Warriors of Khorne. Now, they still have that frenzy, so they'll do a lot of damage, but they're very tanky. They have a lot of armor, and they have a silver shield. So, missile units, beware, don't hit these guys because they'll survive that. Great melee attack. Decent melee defense, especially for Khorne. This is a very decent amount of melee defense, and still quite decent weapon strength, although just normal weapon strength. They don't have any typical, you know, anti-infantry or armor piercing. They're there as a holding infantry that actually does some damage, especially in the late game. You can definitely field Chaos Warriors of Khorne throughout your whole campaign. They get even better melee attack and melee defense, so these guys are very strong holding infantry. You know, they're there to soak up until you get better units to do the damage. Now to a different unit, the Forsaken of Khorne. Now these are very heavily armored, they don't have a shield, so be wary. They're more like the damage dealer of Khorne, really, especially in the early game. They do have quite the weakness on that very low melee defense. They're just well prepared to dish out a lot of damage. You know, if you can charge them into an enemy that you know is going to rout, then they'll become quite good for you. They do have fire attacks. That weapon strength is massive, even though it's not predominantly armor piercing, and they have such a nice charge bonus, so always ensure that you charge these guys. That's true for any Khorne unit, but just make sure that you do so for the Forsaken. In the late game, you can still field a couple of these guys, but be wary, they don't get a lot of melee defense overall. You know, 25 is a very low number, so they're always the glass cannon. Always the glass cannon. They do get a lot of speed, which is great. You can find a use for that, but don't expect them to survive for longer in any stage of the game. And now to a variation of the Chaos Warriors of Khorne, these ones with halberds. They don't have that shield, but still plenty of armor, good leadership, good melee defense still, especially for a halberd unit, and of course they do have that anti-large, so it's quite a nice amount. So these units are perfect to stay on the flanks, covering from enemy cavalry, while the other units do the damage. They don't have a lot of charge bonus, but still, so their main idea is of course to remain still with that bracing to ensure that they don't take the enemy charge in full force. Well, pretty self-explanatory, especially in the late game. You can still field these guys, definitely. Chaos Warriors are always a good unit to bring out, especially they get so much melee defense and melee attack and even weapon strength that they will certainly overcome even the largest or the heaviest of cavalry units. Just ensure that they are not under attack by lots of missiles, of course, because they lack that shield. And if you prefer once more to do damage instead of soaking damage, let's go for Chaos Warriors of Khorne with dual weapons. These are anti-infantry, a nice variation, still no shield but plenty of armor and leadership. And of course they have that bonuses versus infantry. It's not much, but it does imply that they are perfect to mow down enemy infantry targets, especially in the mid-game where they show up. The early to mid-game, that's where they show up. In the late game, of course, you can field these guys perfectly. They will have even more melee defense and more melee attack, getting into the 50s there, and that weapon strength it's still increased, so by all means you can use these guys to counter enemy infantry anytime. Now we have a Regiment of Renown. In this case, this is the Brutes of the Hound from Norska, the Marauder Berserkers. You can hire them as Khorne because they're kind of Khorne aligned. That's the idea, so they do have that mark of Khorne. Note that they are unbreakable, which is really good for any unit that is there to dish out damage. Of course, not a lot of armor, decent amount of hit points, really crazy good melee attack and weapon strength with the bonuses versus infantry. So now you know their role. They have a nice charge bonus, so ensure that they do charge. And they also have the berserk ability. Now the intensity with this increases with the time they spend engaged in melee. So the more they are in melee, the better for them. They get physical resistance, melee attack, and they can even rampage. They also cause fear, which is excellent. So overall, a great damage dealer unit. Now to one of my favorites, the Exalted Bloodletters of Khorne. They are demonic, so be careful with getting their leadership too low. They have decent armor, especially for what they do, because they do so much damage, especially with that armor piercing and bonuses versus infantry. Enemy infantry, beware, they're there to mow you down. In addition to that, crazy good melee attack and melee defense values, because they do have magical attacks and flaming attacks and that charge bonus, so you charge them in and they do short work with anyone. They also have the Hellblade, so you're going to be doing a lot more damage after they get 80 kills. So a good idea is to put these guys against anyone that they can easily mow down, and then they'll become much more powerful into the middle of the battle. In the late game, of course, you can field entire armies of these guys. You know, they'll get even more melee attack and melee defense and weapon strength, everything that you should hope for. They still get some decent armor, but not nothing to, compared to the Chaos Warriors, of course. So even combinations of Chaos Warriors and Exalted Bloodletters will be great. I like to combine these guys with different sorts of units because they are quite a front line in itself, especially against anything that doesn't have a lot of missiles. That's their weakness, as you can see, because they lack armor and they lack the shield. And now to a Regiment of Renown, the Hellforge Host, the Exalted Bloodletters of Khorne Regiment of Renown. Now they have more armor, which is the greatest thing ever for an Exalted Bloodletter. They still have, of course, increased melee attack and melee defense values, still that armor piercing and weapon strength and that bonuses versus infantry. So they're good at doing exactly what the other Exalted Bloodletters do, but they have the Hungering Blades, which increases not only their weapon strength, but also the melee attack with more than 40 kills. So they don't take too long before having those that increase in weapon strength and melee attack. They're just crazy good, one of the top infantry units in the game. You can send these guys against anything and they'll show up victorious for sure. If you're dealing with having the best frontline infantry, definitely you should go for some Chosen of Khorne. Why do I say they're the best? Because they actually cause damage. They're kind of like the best of both worlds. Of course, great armor like any Chosen, very decent shield because it blocks 60% of all small firearms. Notice, I don't know why, but it's bigger than the 55 typical one. They have decent melee attack and very decent melee defense. They have flaming attacks, so they're good against anything that has weakness to fire. Weapon strength, it's very good, especially with the frenzy. You have to consider that the armor piercing weapon damage is still 15, which is decent, and the charge bonus 29, so ensure that you charge them in and they'll do a lot of damage, especially in the late game where all those stats get increased. Particularly noteworthy the amount of melee defense and armor they get: 140 armor and 78 melee defense. Good luck getting rid of these guys. So they are very good holding infantry that still, because they are Khorne, they still dish out some decent damage. And finally, if you wish the ultimate damage dealer in the game, the Chosen of Khorne dual weapons. So one thing about them, they have really high armor, they don't have a shield, they trade that off for an additional axe so that they are a dual weapon and of course a damage dealer. They don't have a lot of armor piercing, but it's still significant, especially with all the buffs, that bonuses versus infantry. They're crazy good at dishing out damage, even to armored targets, definitely. Of course, anything that doesn't have armor will fall just really quick. In the late game, you can field these guys for sure in your front front lines. They are very resistant and resilient. Look at those stats getting up to the 60s and 70s in terms of melee attack and melee defense, and even their weapon strength just increases really well. So forget about the fact that they don't have predominantly armor piercing. They'll get enough to cleave through anyone, really. A nice addition to any Khorne army, that's for sure. So we begin with the Chaos Chariots of Khorne. Very heavily armored, 120, that's really good. Decent speed, quite a lot of melee attack, but of course very low melee defense. That's kind of like a staple of the Khorne army, but particularly also for chariots, so they are kind of the ones that have the least melee defense, but they do out a lot of damage, especially in terms of weapon strength. They do have that bonuses versus infantry, which is always nice, and of course their main purpose to charge into the enemies, maybe into their back line or into their flank, to do a lot of damage. In the late game you can still field a couple of these guys, even if it is just the thematic army, really. They get better melee defense stats, so they can withstand a little bit in melee, of course, but don't keep them too long there. For the most part, keep them charging, take advantage of that speed and charge bonus, and that's it. Now, a bit of an upgrade to the previous chariot, the Gore Beast Chariot of Khorne. They change in terms of getting a little bit more armor and more hit points, and especially the weapon strength becomes armor piercing. So they're very good against those heavily armored targets, especially infantry, because of course they do have that bonuses versus infantry, and still a hefty charge bonus. They do reduce a little bit their speed, but you can still keep them moving throughout the targets and do a lot of damage. Especially in the late game, they just become better at that job. Not a lot of speed, so be wary of that. They are not fast even in the late game, so careful with that. They still have better charge bonus, so you should embrace that. They have even more bonus versus infantry, so definitely that's their main target. Keep them charging through the enemy infantry, mow them down, and that's it. Now, if the chariots are all about moving around, the Chaos Knights of Khorne change that. So they're heavily armored with a bronze shield, so they can survive against those missiles. They do have quite a nice melee attack, still decent speed, by the way, for any cavalry standards, especially heavy cavalry. They have flaming attacks, so beware any trees that you may find. Their weapon strength is not majorly armor piercing, but it's still quite a lot. You know, they get to the point where the fact that they are not armor piercing, you can't barely see it. Do note that even though they have quite a nice charge bonus, and you should take advantage of that, these are a melee cav. Their stats indicate that. They are supposed to charge in and keep fighting there until they overcome their enemies, especially with that fear, especially with being immune to psychology because of that frenzy. So just ensure that you support them with anything else, maybe hero against more tougher targets, or keep them away from any anti-large dedicated infantry or enemies. But other than that, they are supposed to stay there and kill, especially in the late game where they get even more melee defense, more melee attack, more armor, more leadership. Keep them in the fight and they'll do a lot of damage. Now, if you want the shock cavalry version, that would be the Chaos Knights of Khorne with lances. So pretty much the idea here is that they get a lot more charge bonus in detriment of their melee defense. So that's the idea here. They still have plenty of armor, they still have shields, they still have the same amount of speed, mainly the same melee attack, I believe. So basically now you know. These are the ones that should be used as shock cavalry instead, majorly against anti-infantry. Be careful, of course, of those armored targets, but they still have quite decent ones. In the late game, of course, you can field definitely armies with these guys. They'll get just much better at their job, really, with better melee attack and melee defense stats, and leadership and armor, everything that you would like. No improvements to their speed and charge, which is kind of a pain, or the weapon strength, but still, they'll do their damage, especially when you charge them. You already know what to do. Now, if you're searching for a different kind of cavalry, then we have the Blood Crushers of Khorne. These are demonic cavalry, so be careful with that leadership. You already know. If it gets too low, they start getting damaged, all that stuff. And they are very heavily armored. They have decent melee attack, and they have magical attack, so they're perfect against those with physical resistances, such as ethereal units. And the best advantage is that they are armored piercing, and they still have the bonuses versus infantry. So now you know their main targets, armored and enemy infantry. They have a decent charge bonus, which means that you should charge them in. They don't hold on for too long in melee, so make sure that you abuse that charge bonus. In addition, they have the Hellblade passive ability, which implies that they get more damage with more than 80 kills, so just farm those kills and then they'll become much more powerful. In the late game, you can definitely field some of these guys in your armies, especially with that magical attack in place. They are much better as a shock cavalry, really, with that melee attack, with that charge bonus. Not a lot of melee defense, so be wary of that. They do get an interesting 50% fire resistance, so if the enemy has fire attacks, by all means, grab a couple of these guys so that they can survive much better. Now to a Regiment of Renown, the Heralds of Khorne's Fury, Blood Crushers of Khorne, Regiment of Renown. There's an interesting aspect to them. So alongside the better stats overall, still armor-piercing weapon strength, they do have flaming attacks, and they have an interesting ability, which now it's clarified. It gives weakness to fire damage to enemies in range. Previously, this would give a reduction in the fire resistance, which is not the same. Now it does what it should be. It reduces the enemy melee defense and gives them a weakness to fire damage, so of course everyone that causes fire will be doing more damage. A perfect unit to have that specific playstyle. They still have that Hellblade ability, so with 80 kills they'll do a lot more damage. And yes, definitely really good to bring alongside any other units that of course cause the fire damage. Now for the toughest of the tough, the Skull Crushers of Khorne. These are armored and shielded, so heavily armored and shielded. They have a decent melee attack, very good melee defense still. The weapon strength is armor piercing, and they have a bonus versus large. So now you know the target, anti-large cavalry basically. They're still a shock cavalry by any means, so that speed and charge bonus specifically should be used. So these are the ones that you'll put in your flanks to dominate against the enemy cavalry, especially in the late game where they get even better stats, to the point they become a melee cav, really, especially with that additional armor and melee attack and melee defense getting very much increased. Very resistant to spells as well, which means that the enemy is going to have to face them with their own, missiles. They have a shield, so it's kind of an issue there, and sending maybe their infantry with anti-large. That's the sort of idea that you need to watch out for. Still, they're very, very, very powerful and an excellent addition to any army. Now to one cool looking unit, the Knights of the Brazen Throne. These are Skull Crushers of Khorne ROR. They trade that shield, by the way, with some better stats of course, and an armor piercing weapon strength, and this time they have a bonus versus infantry. So they are perfect to dish out tremendous amounts of damage to enemy infantry. Still decent against enemy large, trust me. They're very powerful. In addition, they have a murderous charge passive ability, so they get more mass, charge bonus, charge speed, acceleration when they are charging, and this recharges if they are engaged in melee. So the first charge that they do won't happen. This won't happen. They need to charge someone first, and then this recharges, and then they get the passive ability. So that's the sort of idea. Charge a weak target before they go into the main target, and they'll do a tremendous amount of damage in any army. Now to a unit that should not be overlooked, the Marauder Horsemen of Khorne, one of the few missile units from Khorne, and quite a decent one. They don't have a lot of armor or any combat stats, but they're still quite decent, especially for a missile cavalry, so they can overcome other missile cavalry units. Especially their weapon strength, they do have a bonuses versus infantry, so they can run down enemy infantry units, especially if they have low armor. So they're perfect at skirmishing anything, and then for instance hitting the enemy backline, the enemy missile units. They're really cool for it, especially because their missile is armor piercing. So these guys are kind of a cool hybrid cavalry unit, which is really good, especially for Khorne, because they lack those missiles, and having those, it's always an advantage, of course. They do have the advantage of having Vanguard deployment, and they can fire whilst moving, so enemies beware. In the late game, they just become better overall, and especially their missile stats don't increase, but it's their melee stats that increase, to the point that they actually become quite a decent melee cavalry of sorts. Now, of course, you're not going to send these guys against enemy cavalry or in enemy armored infantry, but they just become quite a nice staple in your army. Very good to have some combinations with Khorne and some missiles, of course. Chaos Warhounds of Khorne. Your first beast, basically they're very light armored, and they're very light cavalry, let's say, of sorts. That's how I like to think about them. They have decent melee attack and good weapon strength for their value, of course. Very poor melee defense, very poor armor. They do have some missile resistance, but that's not the main purpose. So the main purpose of these guys is their vanguard deployment and the fact that they also have Strider, so they can just go anywhere and harass the enemy backline, their artillery, their missiles. That's what they're good for, particularly if the enemy lacks anything fast to counter them, such as their own cavalry or any flyers, for instance, and even then they have the speed to cover from that. Now in the late game, or after any upgrades, for instance, they just become really better at their job. They do get a nice bonuses versus large, so at least they can fight off against similar light cavalry units that try to chase them off, and they have definitely the speed to catch them on. But they are not going to be any front line or any mass unit that you want to use, because basically their purpose is strictly harass the enemy, get rid of their skirmishing cavalry, get rid of their units that are routing, that sort of idea. Now to Chaos Furies of Khorne. Basically the main idea is that they are quite a glass cannon. They're very fast, they fly, so they're the same as the Warhounds, but they do fly, as in they have better melee attack and magical attacks, of course. Still weak melee defense, weak armor. Don't leave them in prolonged combat, they'll die very fast, but they do have a decent weapon strength, so they're perfect to get into the enemy back line, get rid of their artillery, get rid of some of their missiles or anything really weak. But just ensure that you don't leave them in prolonged combat, because of course they are very weak, they'll die. Even in the late game, they are just much better versions, really, of what is a glass cannon flying unit. They won't clear the skies or anything. They do cause damage, but they'll take too much damage very fast. They are much faster in the late game, and they do have a nice charge bonus, so perfect to even have a couple of these just to get rid of enemy artillery. That's the main purpose that would convince you to use them. Now to a very cool looking unit. I always love the aesthetic of it. The Flesh Hounds of Khorne. They're very fast, they have vanguard deployment, which is really cool. They are demonic, so be careful with that leadership getting down. Okay, they don't have a lot of it. Decent speed, much better melee attack and melee defense stats, so these are quite improved versions of the Chaos Warhounds, really. And their weapon strength is really good. It doesn't have too much armor piercing, but it's still very cool. Especially with that charge bonus, definitely these guys can engage a lot of targets and get rid of this. Still that magical attack, which is good. Now in the late game, they become just quite decent shock cavalry, let's say. Let's call it as such, because that's exactly the role that you can use these guys for. In particular, because they get so much speed and a charge bonus, of course, you should be aiming for that. They still gain some bonuses versus large, so they do become a little bit better against enemy light cavalry, for instance, or any light monster that you may have, that you may face off. Their leadership also increases, which makes them survive a little bit longer, especially important given that demonic notion that you must have. So better leadership for these guys is always welcome. And yeah, definitely a great unit to have in any army composition, just because they're so fast, so versatile. You can harass the enemy back line, and you can even engage in this case some of their weaker flank units, really. So just be careful against any anti-large dedicated units, because of course they'll crumble very fast. And now to a regiment of renown, the Hounds of the Blood Hunt. The Flesh Hounds of Khorne ROR. And basically the same style of unit, very fast, good to harass, but they do have dampen. They remove magical attacks from the enemy, and they remove spell resistance, which is great, especially against those that do have those magical attacks. Fighting Tzeentch, for instance, it's always perfect because nearly all of their units have magical attacks. So this just ensures that your physical resist counts a little bit more. In addition to that weapon strength that you've seen, of course, they do have vanguard deployment, which is great. They have immune to contact effects, so poison won't affect them, which is great. And in addition, they have the Gore Feast. this is the best thing. They replenish their hit points while in melee. So a very difficult to get rid of unit for the enemy, good against nearly any target as long as they charge in or flank or charge their rear, you know. It's really a good, wonderful addition to the Khorne roster. Now to the spawn of Khorne. These are anti-infantry. Remember, they have the mark of Khorne, so they do have reduced melee defense in exchange for the frenzy and increased spell resistance. So that is noticeable in their stats compared to other spawn units. It's fire attacks, which is always nice. Good melee attack. Leadership is unconsequential because they are unbreakable, which is great. The weapon strength is their main asset. They do cause a lot of damage, especially with that frenzy. So these guys cause a lot of damage. Mostly a glass cannon, really. And because they are unbreakable, they're just a really powerful glass cannon. Now, in the late game, you can still field a couple of units of these guys. They gain a lot of speed and charge bonus, so you can kind of use them like a shock monstrous infantry. Get in, get out, you know, that sort of idea. Decent melee attack, which will be further increased by, of course, the frenzy ability. They don't overcome their difficulties, though. They don't overcome their lack of armor. They don't overcome their lack of melee defense, so pretty much always the same style, just better at it. Now to your support monster, the Chaos War Shrine of Khorne. Now basically decent armor, very good hit point count, so they'll take quite a punch really. They do have the frenzy and the mark of Khorne, which implies that they have lower melee defense in exchange for more melee attack, and the frenzy of course. A decent weapon strength, not a lot of armor piercing, but still it's pretty decent, and that charge bonus, so you can charge them around, but that's not the main idea. The main idea is that they do have encourage, so it provides a leadership bonus. Then it provides an additional one, with affecting allies in range, the favor of the ruinous powers, leadership plus 10, so they're perfect to have in alongside those demonic units to ensure that they have some leadership to survive without having, you know, being lost. And then we also have the Giver of Furious Glory. This is an augment that increases with intensity, so with each nearby entity death, they give more weapon strength and more melee attack to allies, which is great, especially those because it works with entities. Make sure that they are nearby, you know, units that have a lot of entities to ensure that you get the bonuses really fast. You know, they're perfect to get very close to anyone that has lots of models and it's very cheap, like, you know, any enemy cheap infantry that they may have. This is great to have it there just so that it can rank up the intensity here and then benefit the whole army with those buffs. Now into the late game we go, and the Chaos War Shrine of Khorne doesn't become like really a monster. It just gets better stats overall. It does get a nice bonuses versus infantry, which helps. More charge bonus, so you can kind of charge it around like a chariot. Really, they can fend for themselves, but again, the main purpose of this is to support your forces, particularly important for those demonics because of the leadership. Now, since I played Heroes of Might and Magic, I always loved the Minotaurs, and here we have some Minotaurs of Khorne. Of course, very high stats in terms of melee attack. The difference between these guys and the Beastmen ones is that they do have some armor, which is great. So they're very armored versions of Minotaurs, which is excellent, you know, what a nightmare to the enemies. They have armor piercing and the bonuses versus infantry, so they're very good at taking down those elite infantry units, provided that they are not anti-large elite units, of course. Decent speed and charge bonus, so yeah, just follow them alone. You can use them alone, or you can follow these guys alongside other infantry units for massive carnage. Now, in terms of abilities, they do have the Blood Greed, so with each kill made by the unit, they even get better charge bonus, melee attack, and armor piercing weapon damage, which is great. That's basically the sort of idea. Into the late game, you can bring these guys definitely. They'll just dish out tremendous amounts of damage, making that lower melee defense and lower armor, let's say, completely negligible, because who will survive against these guys, right? And if it wasn't enough, we have the Minotaurs of Khorne with great weapons. These are anti-large units, so basically they're great at taking out enemy monsters, single entities, lords and mounts, cavalry units, whatever. If it is large, bring these guys in, they'll wreck them. They don't have a lot of melee defense though, so they will take damage right away, but they're very good with that blood greed ability still. You know, with each kill they'll do even more damage, so very much a glass cannon sort of idea, but don't count them out. They still have enough armor and melee defense to survive, especially in the late game, of course. You know, considering how, you know, the many large entities rely on their shock value. You know, their shock cavalry, or the even shock monsters, let's call them. You don't require so much melee defense as much as offensive stats to dish out a lot of damage to them, and then watch them rout, and then you can pursue, of course. The Soul Grinder of Khorne. So basically the main idea of this Soul Grinder, every single Chaos faction has one, but the main idea is that it does have some range. 120 range, that's decent. Precursor missile weapon, which is armor piercing. It does 3 projectiles that are mainly armor piercing, which is good. And the reload time is quite fast as well, so they cause a lot of damage really fast, and then they just zoom in for the kill. It does have decent weapon strength with a tendency for armor piercing, of course. Tendency. Still decent in stats all across the board, better, good armor, not a lot of melee defense, so the same thing as typical Khorne units, focused on the melee attack. They do have magical attacks and flaming attacks, so yeah, they cause terror. They are demonic, so be careful with that leadership going down. That's their weakness. Their main weakness is that leadership going down. Of course, they do have some physical resistance because they're demonic as well, so yeah, definitely because they also have that missile, of course, you don't have a lot of choices, so that's one of the best things about it. They will always cause some damage, and then of course zoom in for the kill. Now in the late game you can bring a lot of these guys in your armies. They'll always benefit your compositions for sure. They're more of an anti-infantry unit, but you can send them against specific single entities or cavalry units even. They'll do a good job. Now you notice that the stats pretty much increase overall in terms of the fighting prowess, so more weapon strength and more ammunition, for instance there, just a little bit more armor piercing missile damage, as you can see there. Definitely better reload time, so they'll do a lot of damage with the missiles too, but they don't overcome anything of the, you know, of the weaknesses. Just a little bit more melee defense and definitely a little bit more leadership, so that's where they get from being, you know, becoming an elite unit. So definitely a good addition to any army, especially in the late game where you can get all of this. Now, taking up to the skies, we have the Bloodthirster. This is an anti-large single entity. What a powerful entity it is. Armor piercing, damage focus, still that bonus versus large, great melee attack and good melee defense as well. Still decent enough armor, no shield though, but that anti-large and armor piercing will make quick work of any enemy single entities. That's the main purpose that I would use them, to take out the enemy lord or other single entities, but they of course can dish out a lot of damage to anything really. The main advantage is that they fly, they do cause terror, which is great, and they don't forget that they are demonic, so be careful with that leadership. That's mainly their weakness. Now in the late game, of course, these guys benefit so much from it. More damage, more charge bonus, more speed, which is always important, so you can dominate the skies with these guys, which is always nice. And they still have some ward save and missile resistance alongside all those resistances, so definitely a very unique unit in this regard, where they actually become more like a tank that actually dishes out damage. You know, very hybrid in that regard. So definitely just bring up a couple of these guys in any army and you'll be fine. Now to a very cool looking Regiment of Renown, the Khorne's Bloody Fists. Bloodthirster Regiment of Renown, improved stats all around, of course still that anti-large focus. The main benefit here is this passive ability, a ward save, which is enabled if there's a large enemy presence in ability range. So basically if they are fighting against an enemy large unit, they do get that nice ward save. So perfect to taking down enemy single entities really, those flaming attacks, those magical attacks, always good. So yeah, definitely one unit that you should have on an army as soon as possible. And another regiment of renown that you do have access is the Blood Brute Behemoth, the Gorgon, the Regiment of Renown. Now, this guy, he does have the Mark of Khorne. He does have the Blood Greed, so it gains some bonuses with each kill, including, you know, more damage-based focus. He still has the Frenzy, and he is regeneration. He does have regeneration. So, it is a nice heal, by the way, whenever he's in melee, so he's a beast to take out. You can use him against enemy large targets, which is the intended purpose, of course. Good bonuses versus large, good armor piercing, decent speed and charge bonus, so charge him in and watch him take care of anything. Look at that melee attack, 89. Of course, that's caused by the frenzy, but you can imagine how much that can go up, by the way. And yeah, definitely a great addition to your forces. Once you get this available, you should recruit one in your armies, because it's just a nice unit to have overall against anything really, but preferably against other single entities. Onto the Blood Shrine of Khorne. It's a magic chariot, basically a nice, decent chariot. Not a lot of melee defense. That's the popping weakness that shows up, really. A decent melee attack and armor, of course, which is always nice. The speed helps, and the charge bonus as well. These two go linked, of course, so if you have high speed and high charge bonus, charge them around. Decent weapon strength, which is also mostly armor piercing and has a decent bonus versus infantry. So, of course, they're very good to charging enemy infantry alongside your own infantry. Keep them in support, mainly because of these two abilities. So they have Gore Feast, which implies that they do replenish their hit points while in melee, which is great because it compensates the lack of hit points and melee defense. And they also have the Totem of Endless Bloodletting, giving allies 8 melee attack and leadership while they are in range. So, like I said, perfect to accompany any of your units, especially the leadership. Go with demonic units, preferably, of course, but up to you what you wish to use here. They still have that physical resistance and everything because they are demonic. So yeah, wonderful addition. If outclassed a little bit by the recent Chaos War Shrines, you can always use at least one of these for your front line, and it will greatly benefit your forces. And finally, this cool looking cannon, it's precisely that, a cool looking cannon called the Skull Cannon. Now, the main idea, of course, is that range, 380. It is an artillery that actually, it's a hybrid chariot artillery unit. It's really cool. Missile strength, it is armor piercing, so for the most part, you can use this guy against armored targets for sure. Still the same type of stats as the previous chariot, you know, good weapon strength and with a bonus versus infantry. Not a lot in terms of melee defense, so be careful with that. Still decent armor, so in the middle of units that don't have armor piercing, they can rely a little bit. You can rely on them a little bit. Flaming and magical attacks throughout, so definitely very good to use there. Now, in terms of abilities, they do have Skull Feast, so they replenish their ammunition instead. So they don't have a lot of it, 12, but they can replenish their ammunition when you engage them in melee, which is nice. Makes it a nice mechanic. If you call out, you know, you use all the shots and then suddenly you don't have any shots, you engage in melee, you get more shots, which is always nice. And then we have also the Gore Feast, so it does replenish the hit points here. So just be sure that you have both, you know, that you remember both, that you can send them out in melee and become, you know, a great unit overall. Those two abilities always make this unit really much more reliable than just stats, let's say. Remember that it is demonic, so the leadership is a problem. Be careful, don't let it go too low. Of course, in the late game that is somewhat overcome because, of course, 75 leadership that you can get these guys to, alongside any bonuses that you can give them, is decent enough for them not to rout immediately, you know. And in addition, of course, they get better stats in terms of their missiles. In one particular one is the range. They can get quite a lot of range, so from research. So as soon as you get that range, by all means, have a couple of these guys in the army. They're very good at picking off enemy artillery or other single entities, of course. So yeah, that's a cool unit that is sometimes overlooked in the Khorne roster, but definitely you can use these guys throughout the game. And there you go. every single unit from the Khorne roster, these brutal damage dealers, melee focused warriors. So basically all of those unit stats before and after research, XP and redline skills. I do hope that this helps you out in building even more varied armies with Khorne and to enjoy the faction even further. So without further ado, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.